to the June 26, 2018 Shelburne Select Board meeting, which I now call to order. The first item of business is to consider approving the agenda. In advance of motions to that effect, there are two changes that I would propose. There is potentially a third. I'd like to take those in separately. In the first case, we are proposing to add an item regarding payment of a construction permit for the center project in the amount of $6,500, a fee which we're going to propose to waive. This is a payment from the town to itself. And that item I've proposed as 13B. The second item that I will ask you to approve is an addition to 14B, and that is to add a second reason for executive session regarding Vermont railway litigation. And in the third case, do you want to offer something?
No, if we are going to discuss it in 9, that will be fine.
Which we definitely will. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'd like to consider the two separately as amendments to the agenda first. Is there a motion to that effect?
Motion.
Second.
Second, any discussion, any comment from the public? Hearing none, those approving, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, and those disapproving, nay. The ayes have it. In the case of the second amendment, I'd also seek a motion.
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
And seconded by Josh. Is there any discussion, any public comment? Hearing none, those approving signify please by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. In the case then, would someone care to make a motion about approving the agenda as amended?
So moved.
Moved by Mary.
Second.
Seconded by Josh. Any further discussion? Any public comment? Hearing none, those approving signify please by saying aye. Aye. And those disapproving saying nay. We expect our fifth member, Colleen Parker, to be calling in to this meeting at some point shortly. The next item is to consider approving Select Board meeting minutes of June 12, 2018, which was our prior meeting. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Mary moves.
Second.
Jamie seconds. Any discussion? Any?
Good to me.
Look fine to me. Any public comment? Hearing none. Is there a? We'll put the question. With those approving, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The following item is public. Yeah, I'm going to remember to do that before we leave tonight. Yes. The following item is public comments. Doctor.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Select Board, I realize that this matter that I would like to speak about has nothing whatever to do with any item on the agenda tonight or anything that we've considered here in Shelburne except for one presentation by a Vermont state congressional representative. And that is the matter of approving of recreational marijuana. I mention it because we all read, I hope, recently of the 2 Shelburne Inn employees who ate some marijuana-laced candy brought by some residents of California. And one of them was so severely disabled as to be found relatively unconscious in the parking lot of the Shelburne Inn. I cannot understand why we have spent hours and hours of public education trying to get people to stop smoking. And here we go allowing and encouraging recreational smoking of marijuana. How do those two things go together? Do we have to wait until we have a bona fide tragedy in order to be concerned about this laissez-faire attitude towards recreational marijuana? And do we have to have the police shout it in our ear when we see that some of the traffic stops are becoming more and more related to drug misuse? When I brought it up, when we had the presentation a number of months ago, and I asked the state representative, so now we're going to, the law reads that a person is allowed to have so many ounces of marijuana in their possession, and they're allowed to have so many baby plants and so many adult plants. And I asked, and I was not being facetious, I asked whether or not we are now trying to turn state troopers into botanists, and are we sending the state troopers with scales? And by the way, there was just an article suggesting that very thing, that the state troopers may have to be equipped with scales so they can measure the amount of marijuana they find in people that they stop for suspected impairment. So I'm very, very concerned and upset about this Me Too attitude. Every state is breaking down their own doors to try and follow the lead of Colorado and some other states. And apparently Vermont is going down that very same path July 1st. So I'm very concerned about it. It doesn't make sense. It's dangerous. It's contrary to all our efforts to improve public health, and here we are approving it. What can be done about it? Well, I read that there are some communities, I can't bring them to mind right away, but there are some communities that are enacting municipal statutes outlawing the use of recreational marijuana within the borders of their towns. And I'm suggesting that the Select Board of Shelburne think about that and think about maybe we ought to lead in another direction and outlaw the use of recreational marijuana in the confines of Shelburne for the reasons that should be obvious to everybody who can think about impaired activities that this drug can bring on. I urge that we think that the Shelburne Select Board consider the possibility of some action in that direction before we truly have a tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll certainly consider your comments. Are there any other public comments? Hearing none, the next item is Select Board comments. Mary?
None this evening, thank you.
Josh? Jamie?
Somewhat late delivery, but during school I had a couple of friends who just mentioned that they were very impressed by the police department's use of officers on bikes who were patrolling Harbor Road and really trying to target the mobile usage while driving, and in fact gave a number of warnings. So just wanted to reach out and applaud them for doing that, and I think it's a smart way to do it, and it seemed to be very effective, so more of that if we could.
Thank you. I've got a couple of comments. One, to thank Ann Janda for her service over the past nearly 2 weeks in Lee's absence, although Lee failed to make himself completely absent and managed to keep in touch and keep responding wherever he was. But Ann did double, triple duty over that period of time, and it's a service that we've become used to, but we shouldn't take for granted, and we're very thankful for what she did. At the same time, Lee and I were privileged to be part of what was called a handoff between the project, that is the new library and renovated town hall project, architect, engineer, and the construction manager. That's a procedure during which there is indeed a change of command in effect of the project. And while it may not deserve much notice other than that afternoon, it struck me that we should call to everybody's attention the extraordinary service of the members of this steering committee, who includes residents, fellow residents, and staff who for a period of years have devoted, I would hate to have to count, but hundreds of hours, no question, hundreds of hours of their time to devote themselves to the very best final project that we can erect and maintain. And it's a pretty extraordinary example of community love and help. And at the same time, while there isn't quite the same occasion, the Town Manager Search Committee is in its final stages of coming to the Select Board with a recommended support contractor. That will set in motion shortly after we consider the contract, and I'm going to assume that we will probably do so favorably. That will set in motion the actual town manager search. So we're at points in both processes that are not worth probably any more notice than great thanks to, in the case of the committee, a member of which is sitting here, for all of their efforts as well, all of this in the name of Shelburne. I thank you. The next item is the town manager report.
Thank you. Just a few quick items. I'd also like to thank the board, citizens, and staff who carried the fort in my absence. It was a long-planned vacation long before the interim manager position came up, and I appreciate everyone's understanding and flexibility in that. It was indeed a wonderful trip. We are making progress on a number of areas. As the chair mentioned, the Library Town Center project continues to move forward in tangible and helpful ways. We're also making very good progress on the long-running discussion with the City of South Burlington on a water capacity allocation agreement for water serving the Spear Street area of town. We've been in discussion with the Water Commission. I've proposed a new and interesting approach to minimizing direct cost to Shelburne while still reserving rights for water capacity that we may need in the future. And the city has indicated their great willingness to accept that approach. So I'm hopeful that we'll get that approved at the Water Commission in early July and get that agreement signed and get that done. So doing my best to just help keep things moving forward and appreciate everyone's cooperation in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Is there any public comment, questions? If not, the next item is the wastewater consolidation plan, which is going to be presented by Hoyle and Tanner, whom you may recall were here with us 6 weeks ago, maybe almost 2 months ago, to present the first portion. This is the conclusion, a more than interesting read, and we're delighted to have them, and to have them so early in the evening that they can get home without having to put their lights on.
Good evening. Thanks for having us back. I'm Mike Schramm with Hoyle Tanner & Associates. I'm joined with my colleague, John Riley. We were here back at the May 8th meeting, and we presented on what we referred to as our Phase 1 study. That was the comparison of 3 alternatives. At the request of the town, following Phase 1, we embarked into Phase 2, where we explored what we referred to as alternative number 4. And I will get into all the details on what this all entails. I will say right off the bat, it gets a little confusing. We have 2 treatment plants. We have Phase 1, Phase 2, alternatives 1 through 4. So if anyone is getting lost at any point, please just slow me down. So we're going to walk through these components. I'm going to spend just a few minutes giving a background and an overview of Phase 1 to bring everybody back up to speed on what we covered back last month. We will introduce what Phase 2 covered and alternative number 4. John will talk about the wastewater needs and the Bartlett Bay Treatment Facility in South Burlington. We'll review alternative number 4, how it stacks up with the other 3 previously identified alternatives. We'll conclude with the summary of next steps and also look at what a conceptual project schedule might look like. Okay, so really quickly, most everyone in the room probably is aware of this, but the town owns and maintains 2 wastewater treatment facilities. Wastewater treatment facility number 1 is located on Crown Road. Number 2 is located on Turtle Lane across from the community school. Both facilities are approaching their 20-year service life and are starting to be considered for major refurbishment probably within the next decade. The Phase 1 objectives were to step back and think, would there be long-term advantages for consolidation of wastewater treatment capacity to one of the 2 existing facilities? We looked at 3 alternatives. Alternative number 1 was to essentially stick with the status quo, and the town would stick with both treatment facilities, although they both would need to be refurbished. Alternative number 2 was to convert number 1 to a pump station and refurbish wastewater treatment facility number 2. And it's sort of the opposite in alternative number 3, where existing number 2 would become a pump station and number 1 would be refurbished and accommodate the entire town. And I just remember, if you just want to go back for a quick second, John, I always keep them straight because number 2, we're keeping plant number 2. So it's just a little trick to remember that. Okay, the summary, after we got through Phase 1, and these were the sort of the main outcomes, and that is that consolidation from 2 to 1 would have very good benefits for the town. Last presentation, we walked through the economic cost estimates, and we'll do similar tonight when we look at alternative 4, but very good economic benefit. And also, we looked at a non-economic benefit analysis, and when sort of considering all those factors, alternative number 3, which is the refurbishment of plant number 1, really pulled ahead. That was the factors favored alternative number 3. So, next slide, please. The Phase 2 objectives essentially build upon Phase 1, where we said, well, if there were long-term benefits to the town for consolidation from 2 plants to 1, which was certainly shown within the Phase 1 report, should we sort of expand this thinking and maybe consider consolidating even further? Essentially, the town would get out of the wastewater treatment business, and all of our untreated wastewater would be pumped up to the city of South Burlington's Bartlett Bay treatment facility, which is located about 1.75 miles north of treatment plant number 1. So again, it was this economies of scale sort of worked, and there were benefits with consolidation to 1 plant in town. So let's broaden that analysis and look, does it make sense to bring our flow up to South Burlington? Alternative number 4 is essentially to do just that. Treatment plant 1 and 2 would become pump stations. Everything would be pumped to the Bartlett Bay Wastewater Treatment Facility, BBWWTF. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick snapshot for those of you who are not familiar with where the Bartlett Bay facility is located. It's immediately west of the Magic Hat Brewery off of Bartlett Bay Road. It was last upgraded in 1999. I should say that the city of South Burlington owns and operates 2 treatment facilities. They have the Airport Parkway Treatment Facility and Bartlett Bay. This treatment facility has a 1.25 million gallon per day average daily flow capacity, cloth disc filtration, UV disinfection, and also discharges treated effluent directly into Shelburne Bay. Okay, so just to give everybody sort of look at this on a map, alternative number 4, we are pumping from treatment plant number 2 north, okay? So not sure if everybody has their bearings. You can see Shelburne Bay up in the upper right-hand portion of the slide. Next slide, please. And then there's a faint red line. For conceptual purposes, we have routed the new pipe along the rail corridor. So on the far left of the screen is plant number 1. We're continuing north, again, less than 2 miles, about 1 3/4 miles, all the way to the right-hand side of the screen, across Bartlett Bay Road, and to the Bartlett Bay Treatment Facility in South Burlington. Okay, I'm going to hand things over to John, who's going to talk about the wastewater capacity.
Good evening, everyone. The existing Bartlett Bay wastewater treatment facility has an existing permitted capacity to handle a peak hourly flow of 3.75 MGD. Next slide. And as we can see here, this is table 4.1 from the report, and this shows the needed 2047 design flows to serve both the town and the city. The combined town and city needs in year 2047 will be just under 2 million gallons per day, and that's average daily flow. And the peak hourly flow needs would be 8.25 million gallons per day. Next slide. Okay. And so the existing Bartlett Bay wastewater treatment facility capacity is not adequate to serve the future town and city needs. The existing capacity of 3.75 MGD is far less than the 8.25 MGD that is needed in the year 2047. And so under alternative number 4, the Bartlett Bay plant will be substantially upgraded with regard to capacity to meet the city and town's needs in the year 2047. Our conceptual basis of design for alternative number 4 at Bartlett Bay included continued use of the Kruger AO process because the city has had, it has served the city well during the past 2 decades, and also because with just very few modifications, the plant can be upgraded to serve the full 8.25 million gallons per day within the existing tankage, just making some minor modifications. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mike to discuss the alternative number 4 cost estimates.
Thank you, John. Before we get into the actual cost presentation, I just wanted to start off with these points here. One is that all cost estimates that were developed and are presented tonight, and also within the 2 written documents, are really for comparison purposes. It's to sort of compare these 4 alternatives, not for budgeting purposes. Back in 2016, Hoyle Tanner did a study for the city of South Burlington where we estimated what the city's future refurbishment of the Bartlett Bay treatment facility looks like. They are just in the early stages of their planning for their next refurbishment. And that work, just for the city's component, is approximately a $17 million project. So I bring that up now because when we get into the next couple slides, when we look at what the full Bartlett Bay refurbishment is, we subtract out the city's portion that's been estimated at $17 million at this point to arrive at what the town share could potentially be. We're going to walk through 3 cost estimates, the first one being a project cost estimate. That's really what it would take to design and construct each one of these alternatives in the near term. Number 2, the life cycle cost. We're looking over a 20-year planning period, so in addition to the project costs, we take the annual O&M costs and we bring that to a present value. And then finally, on the cost and effectiveness presentation, we take the life cycle cost estimate and we add to that a present value of what the replacement would be after the next service period. So this is the same format from our May 8th presentation. The only change here is going to be, we'll be looking at 4 alternatives. So I know there's a lot there. Again, this is the project cost estimate. So this is what it would take to design and construct. Rather detailed. I'm not going to get into all the detail. There's a variety of factors, mobilization, overhead and profit. There's a contingency factor that's incorporated here. We have 4 columns, alternative 1 through 4, moving to the right. I think the main point is that if you look at the lower right-hand number, the bold number of $22.8 million, that would be the town's share. So if you look right above it, you see the $17 million. That's being subtracted out of a $39.8 million upgrade to the Bartlett Bay facility. The town share would be 22.8. That's approximately 36% less than alternative number 1 at 35.7 million, which is the refurbishment of wastewater treatment plant 1 and 2, essentially sticking with what the town has now. So significant savings, and that is really sort of near-term dollars. That is what it would be to go design and construct in the near-term future. Okay, table 6.2 from the report. This is the present worth analysis where we're looking at 20 years worth of O&M. Again, the lower right, $30.1 million. That is the estimate of In today's dollars, when we annualize the O&M costs and bring them to today, we're at $30.1 million compared to $48.4 to construct and operate and maintain 2 treatment plants. So we were at a 36% savings when we look at the near term. When we look out 20 years, that savings even grows. I think we're up to approximately 38% less. Alternative 4 is 38% less than alternative number 1. Next slide, please. And finally, the cost effectiveness analysis, which builds upon the life cycle cost with the replacement out after the next service life. I will point out, if you look at the upper left in this case, the $17.2 million conceptual replacement cost for alternative number 1 is the largest of that line. And essentially that is because 25 years out from now, or approximately 2047 is really where we're at here after the next upgrade would be completed, we would still have to then refurbish 2 treatment plants. So if the town sticks with the 2 treatment plants, that reoccurs every 20, 25 years, you'd be refurbishing 2. So we see that savings now grow even further. When we look at this even longer time horizon, alternative number 4 is approximately 42% less than sticking with 2 treatment plants under alternative number 1. Okay, getting out of the numbers for a minute here, we looked at non-economic factors associated with number 4. Alternative number 4, pumping up to Bartlett Bay, well, the Bartlett Bay facility discharges directly into Shelburne Bay. Now, you may recall at the last presentation, alternatives number 1 and 2 rely on the continued use of treatment plant number 2, which discharges into McCabe's Brook. McCabe's Brook is a relatively small, sensitive receiving stream with strict discharge limits, which we can anticipate will probably become stricter in the future. So treatment plant number 1 and Bartlett Bay avoid McCabe's Brook, discharge directly into Shelburne Bay. I will point out that Bartlett Bay also has a dispersion system that goes into the lake that even creates more of a mixing zone when the effluent does hit the bay. There would be construction impacts associated, well, of course, with any of these alternatives, but, force main, constructing a line all the way up to South Burlington, there would be construction-related impacts. The 2 treatment plants would be converted to pump stations, so you'd have common construction impacts, noise, traffic disruptions, dust, so forth. After the project would be complete, we see a reduction in treatment operation impacts. At this point, our 2 treatment plants have been closed down. They're now pump stations. All treatment is happening up in South Burlington. So we would see a reduction in the town of associated noise, odor, so forth. When we look at all 4 options from energy consumption, alternative 4 fares the best. That does include the energy it takes to pump up to South Burlington. So it's the least energy intensive treatment option. Worker safety, we would anticipate multiple staff on site at the Bartlett Bay treatment facility. The town would still be managing the pump stations here in town. And finally, I did want to mention there is an existing procedure for sort of combining the permit allocation. So Shelburne has permit allocation for its 2 existing treatment plants. If ultimately the decision was to go up to South Burlington, that treatment allocation, that permitted discharge allocation, there's a procedure in place where that can be revised so that the city essentially gets the treatment capacity that Shelburne currently has, and they have an expanded permitted capacity to discharge. The point I really want to make here is that there's not a precedent or a procedure at this point for sort of separating that out. If at some point way down the road the town wanted that capacity back, there's no defined procedure at this point that we're aware of where that's been done. So not to say it's not allowed, there's just not a precedent for it. So in summary, if anyone here is still with me, alternative number 4 would have both short-term and long-term economic benefits. So again, right off the bat, in the construction period, it's less, significantly less, and that only gets better the longer you go out in the time frames we looked at. And when we look at the non-monetary factors that I just presented, alternative number 4 rises to the top. The next steps. I alluded to this earlier, but the city of South Burlington is just in the early stages of planning their next refurbishment of the Bartlett Bay Treatment Facility. We would encourage, if the town is interested in exploring this option further, to enter into discussions with the city and try to frame out what the next step could look like if the town were to engage in trying to consolidate treatment with the city. Recommendation number 2 is to continue to explore potentials to further reduction of II, inflow and infiltration. We covered this last time. I wanted to keep it on here just as a reminder. This is the water that's making its way into the collection system, groundwater, rainwater, stormwater runoff, so forth, that is increasing our peak flow rates, which results in larger treatment capacity that needs to be constructed and associated dollars. So there's been work done already in the town to eliminate II. Further reduction would result in a smaller treatment plant, lower dollars. And finally,
Sorry, Mike,
no
are those
problem.
costs built into the scenarios?
The numbers I just presented it continues the current peaking factor that the town is currently experiencing.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
yes.
So
They are built in that respect.
it's assuming that
Yeah.
that portion of II is already in there and it's not coming out.
Yeah.
So if there was significant II reduction, you could consider that those numbers I presented tonight would pull back.
And that's a separate body of work to explore? That second
Something
part?
like that could be done during a preliminary engineering effort. Yep. And-
Do you
sure.
anticipate that the growth in II would be greater than capacity demand?
The growth in II,
Was the rate of II, would that increase, would that increase be greater than the increase of demand? In other words, is that going to be a worse factor as we go along by estimate?
what we've done in this report is to assume that it stays steady. I believe it's if you go back to that earlier slide, John, the one you presented, where it shows the cities, forward one more. Okay, so average daily flow, 0.706, this is in the town now, and we're seeing a peak hourly flow of 4.5. So is that
About 6.5.
6.5 peaking factor, okay? If you look at what the city of South Burlington experiences, their peaking factor is only 3.
That's across their whole system or just the one?
I'm not sure about that. That's Bartlett Bay specifically. So that's we sort of jumped right over that, but that is an interesting point right there. We're looking at a peaking factor of the town of 6.5 thereabouts, and for the city of 3. So there's real capacity to be saved if we can reduce II in the town.
Yeah.
Okay, sure, yeah.
The effluent that the Bartlett's Bay facility discharges into Shelburne Bay, would you consider that, and this may be antiquated terminology, but is that actually a tertiary type of treatment that waste
Yeah.
return?
They do have cloth disc filters at the Bartlett Bay Treatment Facility, and they utilize ultraviolet disinfection. So, yes.
So that's up to the standards that are considered tertiary
Yes.
treatment?
Bartlett Bay is performing very well. Hoyle Tanner, the company I work for, did the design of the upgrade back in the late 90s, and I believe it's currently operating below its permit limits for phosphorus.
Yeah.
So it's operating very well.
Okay.
Okay.
Chris, would you like to comment before we hear other members of the public?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment quickly on the I&I aspect. Typically, I think right now the standard in the industry is around a 3, and we are about twice as much. And we know that I&I has been an issue. It's been an issue for decades here. But as you see, we have some collection system work going on. Everything we do is hopefully going to be reducing this I&I, and we've actually taken on I&I projects in the past. So we're going to expect to continue to do that all the way until whatever decision is being made. of whether or not we go to Bartlett's Bay or not, we're still going to move forward on that because it's still going to be beneficial. We're still going to own this collection system, and we're still going to have to pump this to Bartlett's Bay. So it only makes sense that we're still going to want to try to tighten our system up. So we'll still be doing those efforts.
Well, it's kind of, excuse me, Mayor.
Two questions. How many Shelburne residents does the current system serve? I don't recall. 4,000?
Do you know percentage? 4,000? Yeah, probably 4.
So that leads me to a bunch of questions having to do with pricing. So if we're only, the city of South Burlington has about 18,000 residents. So I'm assuming that the Bartlett Bay facility serves approximately 9,000 residents. I could be wrong, but it's just an assumption. So is the different, so for the South Burlington to do its own upgrade, that's 17 million. But if we piggyback on, it adds on 22,800,000. My question is, why so much just for the 4,000 residents that we serve? And is it the road, you know, is a lot of it getting up there, sort of a one-time?
The 2 pump stations are in that number.
Okay.
What else am I forgetting, John? The capacity itself increase at the Bartlett Bay treatment plant.
The 17 million that the city of South Burlington was considering just to service their own residents, that 17 million did not include an upgrade in capacity.
So we'd be paying for the upgrade in the capacity?
Yes.
Gotcha. And then my other question is, I understand there are other communities that have, that use other communities' wastewater treatment facilities, and I would like to know how that works, because what jumps out to me, obviously, is a lack of control. And, you know, maybe after a while, South Burlington grows so much. In fact, I see there's lots of construction going on, that they say, we can't afford to have you anymore, bye. And then we end up having to, we're stuck. There's a phrase that applies, I think it's SOL, and it's probably a bad choice of term.
An example of that, of what you're saying, is Williston, for instance. Williston pumps all of their stuff to the Essex Junction facility, and they treat it there. And then also Colchester is sending their stuff to South Burlington. So there are those types of agreements out there, those intermunicipal agreements. So we wouldn't really be inventing the wheel. So.
And do they work okay? far as you
I
know?
haven't had a lot of discussions with those municipalities to figure out if, what are the issues. But that's something we'll definitely look at.
Thank you.
John, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, with regard to your concern about, if the city decided that they're expanding so much that the town of Shelburne would need to find treatment elsewhere, similar to the Colchester agreement with the city of South Burlington, Williston and Essex have a similar agreement. Those agreements are pretty tight. The town of Colchester essentially owns the capacity, very explicit capacity at the Airport Parkway plant. And I would anticipate that, a similar, very strong agreement could be struck.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it's like a co-ownership kind of thing.
In broad terms, you could consider it that way. The town of Colchester owns the capacity. The city of South Burlington owns and is fully responsible for the treatment of that wastewater and the permitted discharge.
So as an aside to that, following up on Mary, and this is sort of getting into the weeds of the O&M costs. So I'm assuming most of the costs are for the building and the operation and maintenance for that plant. Now, does that assume that South Burlington's not going to say, okay, well, we want additional charges for using, I'm trying to find out exactly what are the extras that may be part of this that is apart from the operations thing that you've talked about. I mean, and as you say, I'm assuming that's part of the contract that says this is how much we're buying into this amount and that, and there's no potential increased costs depending on the long-term costs of the, over time. Does that am I making sense?
Are you wondering if the city could, down the line, up the rates
Yes.
for the town?
Yeah.
Whereas maybe they don't do that for the city?
All right.
My recollection with the town of Colchester is that they consider the town of Colchester residents and sewer users in the same sort of footing as the city users.
Yes.
We,
And the town of Colchester is still paying back for the last upgrade and expansion of the airport treatment plant.
yes.
So sort of separate. They're paying for the upgrade itself and then paying for the treatment of the wastewater that's being sent there.
Colchester have a user fee?
Have its own?
A wastewater user fee?
I believe the city charges the town the same sewer rate that it charges city residents. I believe the town of Colchester administers the billing. I don't know the details. There may be some administrative charge. I don't know the details of that, though.
In other words, Chris, how might this impact?
I believe that
user
Colchester
fee.
still pays some sort of a fee.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, I haven't contacted them, but it would only make sense because they're still maintaining all those pump stations and their
Sure.
collection system to send it. So that, I'm sure there's probably still some sort of an enterprise fund that's still managing that. It could be off the general fund, I'm not sure, but.
Well, the other part of the O&M part is that we're talking here, or at least what you're presenting, is all for the Bartlett Bay thing. If we do this, we're still operating the pump stations. And so we still have that operate. Is that included into this?
I believe it was, right?
Yes.
That was.
Yes.
That
Okay.
was.
All right, and one other, I think one or more. So I assume that if we do convert to pump stations, we still have two plants that actually have served as wastewater treatment. I assume they have to be decommissioned, and what are the costs associated with that? Is that part of this?
Do you have a demolition
Analysis.
cost or a conversion of treatment facility to pump station in the?
We do have
In the
the
estimate.
cost to convert the treatment facility to the pump stations. We don't have repurposing costs or demolition costs included.
And so that would be extra
That-
cost to the town.
Yes. And it
Yeah.
would be, I couldn't say how much.
I mean, can you give me a ballpark?
To abandon, and I couldn't, not right off the
But
bat.
that's only if you're not using it as a pump station anymore. You wouldn't abandon.
No, you're using it as a treatment facility.
No, what,
No?
so if I understand it, the proposal is to use our two wastewater treatment facilities as pump stations in this plan.
That's
Correct.
right.
Have you factored in the cost to turn these into pump stations?
Yes.
Yeah, but what I was saying is that we still have the treatment part, the tanks and all of that. We have the,
Have
all
you,
of that.
okay, have you not factored in the cost to decommission the treatment piece, the treatment?
We have not.
No.
Okay. Could it sit there dormant? Or would you have to,
It is common for municipal infrastructure that is no longer used to be essentially abandoned. Made safe, electrical is decommissioned, but the costs of demolishing, completely demolishing it, is typically found to be very high.
right, so you're not recommending it be demolished?
We're not making a recommendation
One way or the
at
other.
this time regarding that.
Okay. And the other question I have is, and I think you made reference to this in the report, but I'm just wondering, with all the concern and interest in phosphorus, this is all, based on assumptions that the phosphorus regulations aren't going to change dramatically, but over time, over a 25-year period, how do we try to account for that? I mean, I'm assuming this is something we'd have to account for if we kept it ourselves as well. but how do you think any of that, I mean, are we talking significant factors, multiplication factors, if phosphorus levels need to go down?
Well, I think as you alluded, for the purposes of this study, we really can't predict what the future regulatory environment is going to be like. And for decision-making as with regards to which alternative to take, the future regulatory environment, as unclear as it is, can be considered to be essentially equivalent on all four alternatives.
Yeah, that's the
it's
thing. It's not
equally
gonna be, it's not
unknown.
going to be different
Yeah.
depending on which of these alternatives is chosen.
Now, that being said, there is something to be said for the economy of scale associated with a much larger wastewater treatment facility and its capacity and resilience for more treatment. So if there were stricter, just in broad terms, alternative 4, I would say, would be favored with regard to that matter.
Okay. And I hope this is the last one, but and it's more probably for Chris. I know we get some income from haulers dumping effluent into our system.
Yeah.
What's the proper term?
Our septic receiving.
Sorry, okay. I don't know. Is that a significant figure, or is that something that we would?
It isn't. It's I'm going to say $60,000 to $70,000 a year.
Okay.
That's revenue that we bring in. There's also the cost associated with us treating it and stuff. So the amount of profit is very, very, very small. So.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
that's not necessarily a dependable
Right.
outlet over time, yeah.
It's like anything. It's competitive. If you get a neighboring facility that drops their rates, the haulers start all going there. So you never know what it's going to be.
Thank you, Josh. Are there any discussions, any public comment?
Excuse me, sir.
Sure.
There was one more slide we wanted to present. Is that okay?
We're sorry.
No problem. We're just going to walk through what a conceptual project schedule would look like.
Oh, thanks.
We think it's important, so just want to make sure we got to this.
Large wastewater treatment projects like this can have a very long time horizon, sometimes on the order of 5 to 10 years. And some of the major phases of a project like this would include preliminary engineering shown in the green, which we would anticipate for a project of this size would take about 18 months. And in orange, we have the environmental review and public outreach part of the project. We would anticipate about 15 months to complete that. And then final engineering in red would take about 24 months. And then about a 6-month bond vote period, followed by a 6-month bid period. And then we would anticipate about 24 months for a construction project to be started and to reach final completion and startup. And so this conceptual schedule here shows whichever alternative is selected. This is alternative 4, going online January 1st, the year 2027. And so this is almost about 8.5 years shown before you.
But coupled with that, John, I think if you go to the other end of the schedule, that assumes sort of getting underway with preliminary engineering third quarter 2018.
Yes.
So the main point of this slide is that it's a long-term project, a long endeavor
8.5
between
years start.
planning. I mean, we've already been at it for
A year.
about a year
Yeah.
to this point, which is not even up on that. So, and we're looking at, even if we sort of stick on this, keep marching along, we're still out to not turning the key and starting the system until January 1st, 2027.
So when in that, you said 6 months sort of bonding or a year of bonding, so when would we essentially start paying for this?
Well, we didn't go into a financing study as part of this. Typically, in the state of Vermont, municipal wastewater treatment facilities use the CWSRF loan funding program. Under that program, municipalities can begin planning for preliminary engineering and final engineering using an explicit planning loan from the program. And that program allows the municipality to complete the planning, and then they don't have to begin paying back that loan until 5 years after the preliminary engineering report has been accepted by the program. And typically, within that 5-year period, a municipality will advance on the project and go to construction. And they typically get a construction loan, which would cover the cost of construction, but then the program also rolls the planning loan into the construction loan. So this allows the municipality to complete the planning without significant outlays of finances. And then the whole project gets rolled into a construction loan. The construction loan payback begins 1 year after the final completion. So in this case, if the final completion was December 31st of 2026, the first payment would be due December 31st of 2027.
This might be a question for Chris. I think I asked it the last time, and this is, I guess, goes in the category of stupid questions department. As I understand it, the people who would pay for this would be the people who use the system, and not all of the residents of the town of Shelburne.
That's
The
correct.
system self-supports itself, and rates would have to go up in order to accommodate these new costs, and that would be spread over the 4,000 payers into the system.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Are there any other comments? Is there any public comment?
Lee has a comment.
May I ask a
Sorry,
question?
Lee.
So this is all really useful information, and I'm just curious from a planning and decision-making process, what are the drivers in our system and timing, whether it's permit expirations or operational needs? And also, what drivers exist in the city of South Burlington? If they are starting to think about their upgrades, when would they need to know if we wanted to get involved with them? Because then that changes the dimensions of their project.
Well, before we started this phase 2, we understand that the town... Before we started phase 2, we understand that the town and the city had some initial discussions, and that the city was, generally interested in the concept. The city is planning to advance with preliminary engineering for the Bartlett Bay upgrade next year. And so we would encourage the town to get together with the city to discuss those specifics of how if the town is interested in how the town could work with the city in planning for this consolidation. Is that
So summarize, it sounds like sooner than later is going to be important.
Yes.
I'd just like to add 2 points to that. One, I mentioned back on the May 8th meeting, this concept was identified back in the late 90s, at which time it didn't advance because the timing between the town and the city didn't align. So there is a window right now where this could potentially, it's 20 years later thereabouts, but there's an opportunity here to see if this could work. The other component as far as drivers is, and you never really know where this is going to land, but in recent years there's been incentives from the state through the Clean Water SRF program. I think currently it's a $100,000 grant forgiveness with a match, and that's per project. So that changes from year to year. So I guess, but there has been, for the last several years, there's been fairly generous incentives being offered from the state. So I guess I would look at that as a motivating factor.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lee, Sue?
Susan McClellan, Falls Road. Would the 4,000 people that would be using it, would they be the ones that would be voting, or would the whole town be voting for whatever plan that they decide? I mean, if the users are the ones paying for it, should they be the ones, only people voting for it? The other thing, too, what kind of guarantees are we going to have about pollution? Or are there any guarantees? I mean, you know, our rivers and lakes are, every day you read in the paper and see on the news that there's problems all along Lake Champlain.
Take a crack at this one. I think it's a very interesting question as far as who gets to vote, the people who are going to be paying for it, or all the residents. I could be off on this, but I'm not aware of a situation where a bond vote for something that just impacts users in a system like this would be, that only a subset would get to vote on the upgrade. I'm not aware of that situation. I understand your point, but I'm not aware of that. Secondly, a guarantee on environmental compliance, I guess there would be no guarantee. I can say the city of South Burlington has a long-term history and track record of very, very high environmental stewardship. They operate on NIPD's discharge permit also for what they can put out to the lake. If there was consolidation of treatment up to Bartlett Bay, the town's allotted pounds of phosphorus would be combined with Bartlett Bay's. So that bank account doesn't really change as far as Shelburne Bay is concerned. All three plants currently discharge into the bay ultimately. So that limit goes up for Bartlett Bay. But at the end of the day, the cap hasn't really changed. We're still operating under that same phosphorus poundage. And that is what has come out of the recent Lake Champlain TMDL for phosphorus. So, that's right.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment? My sense?
I have a question. Is this something that we should, I might be,
Anticipating
yes,
my remarks.
yeah, so I'm going to wait for the
What I
chair to
was just
speak.
about to say is that we've all read your recommendations, recommendation 7.18, which is what we've been discussing for on and off here for most of the last 10 or 15 minutes, which is to promptly enter discussions with the city, this is South Burlington, to formally define town and city intent regarding advancing consideration of this consolidation. That would seem to me to be a very useful and important next step. And I would think Lee is hearing, if Jamie joins in, a complete consensus of the board in our interest in taking that. And we would put it in his hands at the moment. And we thank you very much. It's very instructive, very interesting. Yeah, very well done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you have any further assistance, please let us know.
Thanks much.
Thank you.
The next item is ethics ordinance. And Lee, I think, is going to lead off with the help of Jamie and Mary, both of whom are our board liaisons to the Ethics Committee.
Lee Suskin. We met with you, I think, a month ago with a draft of the ordinance. We received comments from all of you at that meeting. We consider those comments. We met again on June 19th. And one of those comments were to have a short and more concise ordinance. And on June 19th, we reviewed a short and more concise ordinance. Your two liaisons, Jamie Hines and Mary Keogh, joined us at that meeting, and we had a thorough review, and we made a lot of decisions. And we developed a new draft, which you should have in front of you. By the way, you may have a one piece of paper about what I'm going to be talking about tonight, if that's helpful. So as you said, I'm going to speak a bit about where we're at. Mike Ashew and Bill Deming from our committee are here. and they may want to speak as well. And your two liaisons may want to comment on any of this in particular. So we made a number of decisions at June 19th, but just to highlight two of them, we made a decision to go with this new 5-page ordinance instead of a 12-page ordinance in hopes that it's clear and all public officials will understand it and all members of the public will understand it. We decided to add a definition of appearance of conflict of interest, which had not been in the previous version. It had not been in the VLCT model code, but we thought it important to include that. We still have a number of issues to resolve. We're going to meet this Thursday morning at 8:30, and your liaisons are invited. Jamie can't make it, but I've asked him to give me additional comments before then so we can consider them. At that time, I think we've narrowed it down, and the liaisons can tell me if I'm missing any, but we've narrowed it down to 5 issues, some of which we discussed, most of which we discussed one way or another at our last meeting, but we didn't come to clarity on, and there are a couple that I have to admit the chair is using his discretion to bring up anew on this Thursday morning. But that's hopefully, since we've touched on these areas, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone on the committee how I feel about them. Aspirational guidelines, we've agreed we're going to be working with you on aspirational guidelines. If we have time on Thursday morning, Ann Janda or one of the members of that committee who form the ones for the employees are going to join us and talk about what they did. I'm not sure that works for public officials, so we'll talk about that. But we agree that we would work with you, and given some other ideas from other towns and cities across the country as another approach to that. But we're now thinking they are not going to be in the ordinance other than possibly a statement that you would ask all public officials to, on an annual basis, certify that they've read the ordinance and take an oath that they'll comply with it. Mm-hmm. Definition of a personal conflict of interest, I think, is I'm a bit concerned because right now the ordinance says you cannot participate if you have a personal interest in the outcome. And we've got lots of volunteers in this town who join CBCs, choose to join CBCs, and put in a lot of hard work because they have an interest in what the CBC is going to be taking up. They may join the recreation committee because their kids need the ball fields. They may join the dog park committee because they want to walk their dog. And we have to somehow clarify whether that is or is not a conflict of interest. So no public official and no member of the public are going to question that. So we're still working on that. Also, this is actually new, but it's something that I read in the last week. If a public official has a personal bias and prejudice to an individual involved in a quasi-judicial proceeding, I think that should be clear, right? It should be clear that requires recusal. And that comes from, I think, not only common sense, but something that happened in this state years ago. Recusal. It's not clear, but we're trying to decide whether other members of the committee, after a member says, I have a conflict of interest, but I think I can be fair, so I want to sit, whether the other members can require that person to step down. Whether a person does go ahead and say, I have a conflict of interest, but I think I can sit, and decides to sit, can a member of the public then later on file a complaint because the person should not have decided to sit? That's not clear right now. I think we need to clarify that. Post-recusal, must the person leave the room? And there, we had a good discussion at our last meeting, but it may be in a quasi-judicial proceeding, you would. In a non-quasi-judicial proceeding, you would not. If it's a financial conflict, is it a personal conflict? So we're still trying to figure that out. That'll be a good discussion Thursday morning. Investigations, and there's no consensus on that. But I think there may be situations, and I think actually it would be very, very rare, where the town may be confronted with an issue that has created public distrust in the CBC. And no member of the public dares to file a complaint because of the cost of that, of investigating or proceeding with a complaint, because of fear that something will happen to them in retribution. So there may be that rare case where the committee, based on what they're hearing and reading, would look at it and decide whether there's probable cause that this is worth an investigation. And then, if so, to appoint an investigator to look into it and then authorize that investigator to file his or her complaint. That has happened in Vermont 30 years ago with the Judicial Conduct Board. So just following that, authorizing and following that procedure. Prohibited conduct, we haven't decided whether a violation, if a public official violates the town charter, or maybe the open meeting law, or maybe the Public Records Act, whether someone can file a complaint for violation of any of those provisions. That's where we're at. So now, Danny, you want to add to that? So, and I think Mary and Jamie can speak.
It's a good recap. It's been a very productive and good relationship, I think. I've been very engaged with it, and clearly this committee is putting a lot of time into the work they're doing, so we thank you for that. I feel like we're at the 90% mark, maybe, in my mind on this draft. I think, I'll just tick through and Mary weigh in. We're both sitting in these meetings, and we don't always see the world the same way, so keep in mind you have 2 liaisons there and 3 others who will need to weigh in on this. And I like the consolidated approach. That was a directive we gave the committee, and I think on balance it's the right approach. The lawyer in me got nervous about what did we kick out of this ordinance, and I think we lost some of the nuance between quasi-judicial and non-quasi-judicial, but that's probably okay in the big picture. I think this will be much more readable and understandable and hopefully manageable for the general public, which was our goal. As the chair mentioned, we're still working through just maybe lack of alignment on a couple of these pieces, which, keeping in mind we may get a draft that we don't 100% support, right? I think it's fair to anticipate that at some level, right? We may have disagreement on some of these points, which is okay, right? I think that's expected from my perspective. My opinion is I think we should keep the aspirational pieces out. We talked about this a bunch. My sense was the committee generally found consensus on that, and we did commit to how do we memorialize that in a separate, call it 2.0 version of a different document and policy, and maybe it's, hopefully it's the ethics committee that puts their hand up and wants to work on that, but maybe it's a different committee.
I think the ethics committee agrees with the way Jamie phrased it. Yes.
I think just having it live somewhere else makes more sense, because there has always been a question about, well, is this content subject to a complaint or not. And I think just taking it out really makes that very black and white, which is a good thing. Recusal, we talked about a little bit, right? I don't think we had some good hypotheticals and scenarios that we walked through that harken back to law school a little bit. And they were, these are hard, right? I think we all agreed, like, these are some of the hardest decisions and judgments that a public official has to make. So, or someone in the public has to identify and hopefully be vigilant about staying on top of. I don't think we came to any conclusions, as you mentioned, on some of these. So I'll just leave that as continued conversation on those points. The one piece that I did want to just talk a little bit about, in my opinion, and I don't think the chair and I see the world the same way, which is, again, okay. On the investigations, I continue to be uncomfortable with it. I think the more time we spend talking about and looking at this, the more concerned I get at some levels. So I don't think we'll ever reconcile that necessarily, because we may just see it differently, which, again, I think is okay. From my perspective, I'm not sure where it would go. I don't know how necessary it is to layer in those kinds of powers and authority for a lay committee. I think you raise fair points as far as there is some precedent within the state with the Judicial Conduct Board, and we did have a dialogue about, hey, it would be nice to learn more about it, and you did some outreach, and before I got to a point where I was comfortable with that, I'd certainly want to have an opportunity to talk with others if we do decide to go down that road. Those were my feedback generally. I don't really have anything else other than it's been a really good rapport and relationship, and all the committee members are fabulous and putting a lot of time into it. So thank you all.
I echo what Jamie said. I really like the idea of taking the aspirational goals out of this document to make it clear, concise. I would like to, I think we need to vet more this whole idea of the investigation. I do want to say that I favor members of CBCs taking some sort of pledge, which is somewhere in my mind between promise and oath, so sort of in the middle, that would talk about civility and some of the things that we've discussed in the committee meetings that we've had. I think that would be appropriate. I think I took some sort of similar, we all do, delay no man for lucre or malice and all that stuff that we've taken oaths on before. So I think it's appropriate, and I think it's wise, and I think it might wend its way into the next item on our agenda, which is the process for selecting members of CBC. So it's a nice segue into that. And I would love it if the Ethics Committee would continue to work on it, but I'll just close by saying these people have put in countless hours discussing these ethical issues, which always leave me feeling like I'm chasing my tail a little bit. They're difficult issues to get a handle on. And so I thank all of you for doing that, yeoman's work for our town. We owe you a debt of gratitude for that. And I'll see you Thursday morning.
Yeah, I'd like to just sort of comment on what I was just thinking, sort of the economics of ethics enforcement. And I was very pleased that at the inclusion of the ability of the committee to do the advisory opinion and help people who are concerned about filing a complaint with that, because I think that's an issue. But I'm also concerned about the point that I've mentioned, that if a complaint does get to a hearing, and there should be a level field there, and if as said, that the sides can be represented by counsel, but someone who wants to file a complaint does not have the resources to be represented, is that a reasonable thing. And you had mentioned the idea of using small claims court ideas, and I know, and again, this is not my field, so I'm not, there is, a public defender portion of, this that I wonder how we can ensure that if someone feels that they need to bring a complaint, that they feel like their interests are going to be well represented if the person that the complaint is against, mounts a very vigorous defense, so to speak, which is certainly their prerogative. How do we even that out so people feel that if they're going to bring a complaint, they have, they're not going to suffer economically or personally from that. I think you brought that up with the whole idea of investigations, and I think that's really important. And I'll just continue talking so you don't have to. And the last part, the last question, sort of the economics again, is the last line on page 5 of D about the ethics committee may spend funds allocated to it by the select board. And obviously we have a history of this being a concern. And I think this is something, I'm not sure I would, whether this gets memorialized in an ordinance or something else, but I think it's really important for the ethics committee to have a certain degree of independence. And I would like to see, I don't know if it's in the ordinance or in some other manner, that there is an assurance that there will be funding for the ethics committee, and it doesn't depend on the whims of whatever the select board composition is at that point. I'm not sure if it's put into the ordinance that there will be funding. It's hard to say how to state an amount, or is it's something else that we do. But if people don't feel that the ethics committee has the ability to perform their duties in what, according to the ordinance, then that is somewhat of a loss of faith in the process. So I'd like to see some mechanism of ensuring that.
Just a couple of responses. I share Josh's concern, and we've seen from our experience that there's got to be a level playing field between the complainant and the public official. And if the public official is a person of means and the complainant is not, you don't have that level playing field unless something else can happen. The ordinance does say the committee shall establish rules similar to those used in small claims court. And what that would do, if I were still to be on the committee, would enable the committee to go from, let's say in the judiciary, you've got hot courts and cold courts. And in a hot court, the judge takes an active role in the hearing and questioning witnesses and bringing out and not particularly helping either side, but getting to make sure that the committee has all the information it needs to make a solid decision. In small claims court, the judge is empowered to do that. It's rare in criminal cases, I think impossible in criminal cases, rare in large civil cases. But in small claims court, it can happen. And so when the committee adopts rules, and the reason it says similar to small claims, my vision is it would make clear that the committee can ask questions of the parties and not in an attempt to level the playing field. In terms of cost, if someone wants to spend $20,000 on an attorney, yes, they're going to have an advantage, and there's no way, I don't see any way to get around that. If, and on funding, and I really see it as a very rare case where the committee would actually hire an investigator who would file a complaint. Then you get into all sorts of different funding and level playing field issues. But I would just like that option. I don't think it would ever happen. In the judiciary, it's happened once in 100 years.
But you certainly do need to be assured that there will be funding.
But then you need to be assured there'll be funding, and I would, if I were the chair, I would argue every budget cycle to get that money. I don't see how you could, maybe you can put it in the ordinance that the select board has to give a certain amount of money, but circumstances change, and I don't see it making any sense.
Yeah, the ultimate authority over money is town meeting,
Right.
so I don't know how we could,
Right.
step in front of that. But there may well be a mechanism. I think there's a demonstrated need, and we certainly are anticipating a lot of consideration of it in the upcoming cycle.
Yeah.
But I think Josh makes the essential point that I do feel as he does that there is a relationship between the accessibility of funds and the force of strength of the exercise. So, given that it's expensive, just simply put. So, and there's another comment. I think this is a great step in terms of the aspirational content. It may be unfair that we make such use of all the work you've done in that area, but we'll certainly attribute it, and we because you've spent an ungodly amount of time on that, and it's well appreciated. But I think everybody has probably agreed that there's a better home for it, and I very much like the way you stated that. So. Is there any other board?
I mean, I think, again, this is just a general comment. The ordinance and the process is working well, in my opinion, when there are no complaints, right? When we're, sometimes I get concerned that is the goal to really develop this very activist committee, which at times I start to see pieces of that, and I don't think that's the intent of the committee, but I want to be careful about. We should be spending our time and resources educating the public, training against the ordinance, training as opposed to turning it into something where it becomes more of a process that can, lead to a more prosecutorial atmosphere and things that just, I think,
Right.
probably no one in town wants.
Mike Ashew said the last meeting, we do plan, the committee will be active. It'll be active in educating public officials on expectations of what the ordinance means. And I'll bring up on Thursday morning some areas where I think there's a lot of confusion among volunteers who serve on CBCs, what the ordinance means and how it's going to apply them. And there's a lot of education to be done.
I think we're all agreed there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is it's not very different from the current ordinance, in my opinion, right?
Right.
So if there's confusion, and I agree with you, there is confusion,
Yeah.
we should address that and prioritize that. I don't think the document will make a big difference between outcomes. Maybe on the margins a little bit, I think it will, but
I think, and it came out from that VLRS report, the Vermont Legislative Research Service, that the committee plays an important role in education. And I know the committee plans to do that.
Do you three want to give us some guidance as to next meeting? Want to come back next meeting? What's your sense of schedule?
I mean, I know the chair is anxious, and I'm, pushing him a little bit on this. I know he wants to get it done, and the committee's been spending a lot of time on this, and there's no hard and fast deadline, but I know he would like to complete the work at the next Ethics Committee meeting and put the ordinance forward to the Select Board
On the 10th.
for consideration whenever the chair
Yeah.
decides to put it on the
That
agenda.
is my plan, exactly.
Right.
I want to finish it Thursday morning and get you something, then you run with it from them, and we
Right.
will be here to comment on your discussions.
Lee, is that,
Yes. We can
Lee and I have talked about that.
work on that, yes.
I think as far as just allocation of time, I think we're going to want to spend time
a bit?
going through it, right? Because we're all going to have some different views, and trying to consolidate the give and take may take a little time as far as just work session goes on this. And I think we've narrowed down the number of open issues very well, but there are still a handful that I think amongst the board we'll need to reconcile.
And then at some later date, we'll need to talk about the aspirational piece or
Yes.
the,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That should,
But that's a
that shouldn't
discussion
hold
all the
this up
time.
at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree, yeah.
we'll also need
Yeah.
town attorney review for the document, so
Yeah.
I don't know where that falls in, but
Good.
thank you.
Yes, the town attorney, I'm sure you would want the town attorney to review it.
Yes.
Yeah. Lots of progress. Glad.
Very
Thank
good
you.
progress.
Super.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lee. Thank you,
Thanks to
Mike.
the
Thank you,
committee.
Bill. And thank you to you both for the, Mary and Jamie, for the effort you're making on our behalf. The next item is the Village Center Transportation Study Synthesis. We're going to be assisted by Lee and Dean, Planning Director. Do you want to?
Sure. I think everyone knows that there has been a fair bit of discussion and momentum about a variety of village center safety issues, transportation studies, where to go with all of this. We've talked about whether the Regional Planning Commission should continue to do some work for us. We put that on ice for now. Talked about whether this could be more of a staff level first step to review the prior studies and synthesize those into lists. They might be categorized by financial impact, operational impact, safety impact, bang for the buck, if you will. It's morphed a bit, and this is really intended to help, after conversation with the chair, to really tee off a conversation with the select board and the community about priorities in general. And while the village center safety issues and transportation issues have dominated center stage to a certain point, there are also a constellation of other needs, priorities, and issues before the select board and the community that need to be dealt with. So you've seen a long list of those. They were published online in the select board documents for tonight. And again, in conversation with Jerry, it seemed like it really wanted to morph a bit into a conversation about priorities generally, and really where are our collective priorities, and should these village center safety and transportation issues continue to be at the very forefront? Should we continue to work on those as we can and realize we have to take on a host of other issues? So that's really the essence of my helping to tee this off this evening for you as a board.
Dean, would you want to comment?
My name was on the agenda. I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to answer any questions, but when I talk with Lee about any kind of presentation, I got the understanding that because of the amount of time that we had, it was going to be just discussion.
Thank you, Dean. Maybe I'll lead off. This is our 5th meeting on this issue. That respects the fact that it's an important one, but it has also shown that we are yet that a resolution and an action plan and some substantive steps are yet within our grasp. So hopefully tonight we can move the discussion along to the point of some decisions about where we go next. My sense is that we got off to an odd start way back when this was first discussed, by the fact that there was some belief in the first night we discussed it, that where money's not spent, they could be spent on something else. That the 1,500 was to some extent found money. And I think at that point, we sort of coupled our discussion of the synthesis and the use of utility of existing versus an additional study with village traffic safety issues of a concrete kind. I think that was probably unfortunate because there is no money available from this synthesis or this discussion. Secondly, we have a very carefully drawn and pretty robust plan in the next budget year on the parts of both the village traffic safety group and the bike pedestrian committee on each of their parts for a total budget of $20,000 plus as a $2,000 call on public works. Which plans and projects are unaffected by any of this discussion? I mean, those will occur. However, whatever steps we decide to take with the synthesis. I think there was nothing but good intentions of questioning additional study without some concrete sense of what existing studies revealed and how much they informed us, what they said, what we have learned from them, and what we might learn from them. I don't think there's any question that at any point on any subject that ought to be one of our first responses. In this case, I think what the town manager is trying to say is that were we not have that night considered a $1,500 increase, would we put at the top of the list of our priorities a synthesis of transportation studies? And I think in most cases, the answer is probably not, that we have in front of us a vast array of priorities, some of which have time consequences and legal consequences and simply can't be avoided or rescheduled. On the other hand, there is, and no one possibly could be speaking more to it from experience than me. To those of you with whom I've sat for several years now, there is a considerable concern, a deserved and demonstrable concern about traffic safety in the village and in other locations in the town. There's no question that that's a priority. In the sense of life or death, it's a priority all of its own, whether it's in Shelburne or whether it's in Ripton or wherever it may be on this earth. So there's no question about the priority nature of something that is of such a consequence to life. But tonight, my hope is we can, in conversation, conclude about where in our list of things that need doing immediately and things that we can address over the next several months, this matter rests. Because one of the things that I think we still should consider is the need for the kind of study we find that is absent, in other words, to fill in blanks that we find in synthesizing existing studies. It's equally the case to know what the current crop, the clutch of 8 or 9 studies say, to know what they don't say, and therefore what we might want to be researching and spending money on ourselves. That's a decision we can make down the line. I didn't anticipate in my experience with our rejection of the grant, of the increase and then of the grant itself, that we were forevermore not interested in possibly seeking grant funds for a study. The question to me was studying what, and we were going to begin with synthesis. Now, with that as part my personal take and part expanding the town manager's comments is where we are, I think, at the moment. And would anyone like to respond?
Yeah, I'm curious that is the assumption that your comments are based on that this is something that the select board itself would be considering? As I remember from our previous discussions, and I think it was the suggestion by Lee, that there are enough people who are interested in this issue that either an ad hoc committee or some other, mechanism would be identified that they would be charged with looking at those studies and probably facilitated meeting with the community, various communities. And so it wouldn't necessarily be a select board effort in itself, and we would ask for that group, however it would be formed, to come back to the board with their findings and recommendations. So I'm not sure if I agree that that given the list of things here that we have to deal with, that it is something that the select board should be necessarily taking up time to do, but that doesn't mean it isn't something that can't be done by the knowledgeable and interested people in the community.
No, I think that'd be super.
Yeah, no, well said. I mean, I think I feel like I said that the first or second time this came up, and it may have been an understatement, but I said, why don't you put 5 or 6 people in a room for half a day and call it a retreat, and let them pull the synthesis together. That may not get us there completely, but it was at least a suggestion to start the process and not put more work on the board's plate to do. At some point, yes, we do have to review the document and decide on what the priorities are, right? But in the meantime, a group of committed citizens who are interested in, yes,
Shall we
they may have their
conclude?
own priorities.
Shall we conclude
There's no
on
way
that
to,
Yeah.
tonight
And that move forward with that
and move
idea.
forward on that
I mean, in
basis?
my opinion, I think
Absolutely.
we've done a good job overcomplicating a topic that's shouldn't be that difficult to
No
me.
one
If you
can
look
argue
at
with
the
that.
studies, yes, they're beefy, but
Abs-
they have discrete recommendations, and you can try to pull it together and have a group sit down for a few hours and at least come back to us with
So
their thoughts, right? It doesn't need to be a formal recommendation. It's just, here's what we've done, and here are our thoughts, and
could we make an announcement of intent to form such a committee and ask for volunteers who are interested in
absolutely,
participating?
right? Solicit interest.
Come back to
and
us by the next meeting?
Correct.
With interest? Would
And
you
then
be willing to take
I
the
think-
lead in that?
Yep, I can do that.
Can they contact you?
Sure.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. In which case, we come back on the 10th, form a group of some definition, ask them to accomplish these same tasks that we've been discussing all these weeks. Come back to us by some date in advance of budget, certainly, that would make sense.
Yes.
So we had that input, so maybe spend a month,
Yeah.
6 weeks.
However,
I think we'd have to bear in mind there could be limitations on staff availability. We'd have to be pretty clear on what our expectations were there. I wouldn't imagine we'd have any stringencies about use of space or anything along those lines.
No, we'd certainly make space available.
And we have interestingly, are having discussions about ad hoc committees and advisory structures and how best to use them, and would that be, you want to comment, Dean? On that general idea? Super.
I hate to be negative Nancy, but I'm still feeling regretful that we didn't vote to allocate $1,500 more so that all of this work could be done by the RPC, so that we could move forward. And I'm glad for Josh's suggestion, which I think is a reiteration of Jamie's suggestion. At the last meeting, I think I was using the word summit. I wanted to have some sort of summit where everybody who's concerned about this issue could appear, say their piece. In fact, I think it was Lee who said we could do something like that on a Saturday, or so that people are emotional about this issue. At least that's the feedback I'm getting, and have want to have the opportunity to have some say, and I think that to do it in a summit format, if this group felt that were appropriate, would make me feel a lot better about the way we voted. And so I'm glad for the suggestion and would very much like to see Josh come forward on the 10th with something kind of concrete. And I hope we have the staff.
At this point,
A name
that
of
we
what?
can formalize in a motion, an ad hoc.
I don't think, I mean, it's
Study
not, am I
group.
missing something? It's not overly time sensitive, right?
No.
It could be late summer,
Yeah,
September type
You
work
mean
where
for
a committee.
report coming back? Or
No, just for a
Just for a
meeting.
committee to
Oh,
get
yeah,
together
no, I-
and start thinking about
Yeah,
this,
I would
right?
think that
As
the
long as
committee-
we have it by,
Yeah,
What?
the group should
October?
formulate.
By mid, well, yeah, September
Yeah.
1
Right.
would be.
Right, so, I mean, we could play it by ear and see what response there is to any announcement and see if it is possible to put something together by the next meeting. If not, it would be the meeting after that.
yeah.
Just as
Right.
formulating a group to discuss this.
So you would prefer the July 10th to discuss some definitions of the group and the process and
Yeah, well,
fill
I
us
think-
in on who had interest? in-
Right, that's what, yeah, and if there's a possibility of, I can work it, if I get responses and I can have conversations with those people sort of independently,
Yeah.
rather than if there's not time to get people together.
And
then
if
we can
not, it
move
would
that.
it could be the following meeting, the 26th. yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I would like to add, I know we've spent some time on this, but I really do think it's important to keep the ball in the air, so I
Yeah,
appreciate
no,
it.
there's no, I think the question was which ball and how long is it going to stay out there until we catch it in hand and start?
What would be helpful to get a consensus of the board at this point is what the sidebars are on this. Is this, because this has been come up all over the discussion. Is this just talking about the core of the village? Is this talking about traffic safety throughout the town? How broad of a
I thought
of a
I
topic
mean,
we were talking?
Dean,
Dean's very familiar with the studies. I think they're broader than the village.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, for the
And
most
that's right.
part.
Is that right?
And
The directory that was put on the online has mostly studies that focus on the
It's all
village, but there are
Few
some that
others.
go beyond.
Yeah.
But while I have the floor, I just wanted to make one other observation. It's important for people to appreciate that while this group that's being created does its work, the Planning Commission is also going to be working on the town plan. And so insofar as we've been talking about studies and specific recommendations and things to spend money on to make improvements, everybody needs to be aware that the Planning Commission is going to be having discussions about the town and transportation and goals and objectives and recommended actions. And there's this complementarity that people need to be aware of. And I hope that the processes work well
Yeah, I agree.
together.
No,
But
that's a good call
just
out.
No, I
in terms
think-
of Josh's
I think
question
that's
about the
killer.
scope,
Yeah.
I think it may be helpful to have a conversation about
Yes.
what's the boundary between the two, because the Planning Commission has a statutory role. It's got to do the things it's going to need to do. It's going to not want to feel like its work is being usurped by another group. It's got to do what it's got to do, but this group also has to do what you're hoping it will do.
And I think that would be a place to start, is to meet with the Planning Commission and sort of try to integrate these kinds of things so they're not happening in isolation.
So if I may, along those lines, another idea that Dean and I had talked about was, rather than potentially forming yet another committee, last time I counted, we had upwards of 24 committees in the town of Shelburne, but integrating into the Planning Commission's work plan, and for example, that perhaps as befits their schedule, that they are potentially the best position to host this event, summit, call it what you will, so that we may not need to have duplicate groups mixing and matching these things, but potentially at the staff level, we could perform this synthesis or, collation of ideas, if you will. The Planning Commission hosts the summit, which then integrates into their town plan work without feeling like we got too many cooks in the kitchen. So I just wanted to put that out as another idea that we had discussed.
And I think probably the first step would be to meet with the planning commission chair and sort of get his ideas of how this can work most effectively.
Yeah, no, it's a good suggestion. My sense was bandwidth is a problem, that they're not really going to have time to focus on consolidating studies and trying to spend time looking at this stuff. That's just my perception. I could be wrong. I'm a little removed from.
I would agree with you, Jamie,
Day to
that
day.
they don't have the bandwidth to consolidate, but if there is an event that you are looking for, an opportunity for people to come and to be heard, they do need to do more public process as part of the town plan update. And transportation has been a really big part of the conversations that they've been having over the last 2 years. So they could be the sponsors.
host.
Indeed, they were the
Okay.
sponsors of the Stormwater Summit, so they could be the sponsors of an event that has to do with transportation and maybe one other things that are part of the town plan. It's a venue for people to talk about. But the Planning Commission might also be the receivers of some of the preliminary ideas that if there's a working
Right.
group created, let them react, let them see it through their filters or through their lenses, and then have it come to you, because they need to know what the ideas that this
I
group is
agree.
going to come up with, and the group needs to know what the Planning Commission's coming up with.
Okay.
Would
I think Bruce had
Yeah, I wanted to comment first. I'm not going to miss you, Bruce. No, would you accept the notion that the principal objective of this effort is to come up with actionable ideas to improve traffic safety?
Yeah, I think
Could
that's
we
right.
establish maybe that benchmark as, so that we're not necessarily focusing on an objective which is just to do the synthesis, or an objective which
No,
has
there
to
has
do
to be
with
there has to-
priority project listing, but more so a question of direction, recommendations to the town as to what should be its priority actions in enhancing safety.
Sure, that seems
So
Would
that
that be a-
sounds much broader to me than what I was thinking about, which is fine. I thought we were just looking at these 15
But-
studies and
But I
putting
think-
them
To
on a
what
couple.
end? Would we be
Yeah, I
just
think
To what
looking at
end
the-
is to inform whether it's the transportation section of the town plan, whether it's our own budgeting
Well, I think
efforts, whether it's other capital improvement planning
Well,
that happens
but
within this
again, I
board,
think,
or-
I think I've heard loud and clear that there, as has been discussed on all of these studies that have been done, there have been lots of studies, there's been very little that's actually happened. And the idea of incorporating it into yet another thing without actually coming up with, okay, we think these are the things that need to be done, I don't think really gets us very far. So I think we need to have the end result as being, okay, these are the things we think need to be done. That still leaves a decision as to how it does happen. But I think, at least to move the process forward, there should be a reasonable assumption that without much, well, I couldn't say much, I mean, that we come up with some, a listing and potentially a prioritization of things that could happen in association with the whole planning process, so that they wouldn't be independent of each other, but incorporated, integrated with that.
Would you be comfortable, Mary, with a principal objective, which is to recommend actionable ideas?
I'm not necessarily against it. I'm sort of more in Jamie's camp on just consolidating and trying to make sense of all that's there.
I mean, I think a more discrete scope. I'm getting concerned that we have a village safety group that is already working with
Itself.
the bike ped group, right?
Yeah.
They're collaborating and, again, sometimes don't see the world the same way, which is fine. And then we have this other work stream happening that somehow has to mesh up with the public hearings on the comprehensive plan,
I'm
right?
saying that this is a collaborative effort, and this is an attempt to make it have an integrative effort in putting all of these. So there isn't, one group isn't, going one direction and one group going another direction. I think there's a real effort to try to coalesce and have everybody moving in one direction rather than.
Can we break it down into smaller pieces perhaps and start with the process of synthesizing these
sure.
reports?
Oh, absolutely.
And then come
Absolutely.
back
Yeah.
and say, this is
Yeah.
the next.
Right.
Because
Step.
we learned and.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think, I would
Yeah.
see that would be the way to go. But I
Yeah.
think, to speak to Jerry's idea, I think the end result should be, okay, these are the things that have been identified that probably should be done, and what might be the prioritization with justifications as to why.
Okay,
Open it up.
Bruce.
I thought Lee's sort of focus paper was very helpful for me to make a presentation tonight on what I think is going on here. There was a couple of aspects of it. First of all, you had basically the workload, this long list of projects. The other issue is, the priority of those things. So I think the solution to the workload is to delegate. You've got a lot of people in this town that are very interested in this issue, putting in a lot of time and hours. The Village Pedestrian Group had these pop-ups and have meetings regularly. They know this issue. They know the roads. They know what can be done. They've had meetings with Local Motion. I would ask those people to give you 3 options, to give the select board 3 options. We've studied this issue. Here's option A, here's option B, here's option C. Can we do something about this? A lot of what you're saying may make sense, but all I see is another year passing. Every time we start moving, I know you said this has been on the forefront. To me, it's been on the forefront and gone nowhere. Year after year after year. It's time, I would think, to do something. On the list of priorities, I don't want to give a hard sell on this, but 50 miles per hour. From my front lawn, Mary saw it tonight. I can actually see the radar sign read out as cars go by. I'm in the historic residential village. People live there, kids go to school. I see 52 miles an hour pop up on that every day. It's going on for years. That balancing, with moving the dog park or something like that. I mean, you said it yourself, Jerry, it's life and death. So I don't see how, and I don't know all the mechanisms, the planning department and all that, what Gene has to do, but I don't know how we can sit here and know 50-mile-an-hour traffic is going through our residential village where, people are crossing and it's very pedestrian heavy. And we're talking about, well, let's have a meeting in October, and then, I just keep hearing it. Next, the summer's gone and we're nowhere again. So I just feel there's, a need for some urgency. You've all got valid points, and again, I thought your focus paper was great, but it really just helped me make my point. I'm saying this is exactly what I'm talking about. I know these people have a lot to do. We can do the work. These people, I'm not exactly part of the group, but that's another story.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, I'm a little bit too out there. But, we know the issue. Local Motion is great. This guy, Jason from Local Motion came there. In a matter of minutes, he knew remedial action for Falls Road, suggestions, low-cost stuff. They're doing it every day in Burlington. Why this town can't do this, to me, is just, a backward-looking town when you see you can't move forward and get some of these issues going, and you've got this high-speed traffic. And I've concluded if it looks like a highway, people are going to use it like a highway. And that's the problem with Falls Road and to some extent Marset. People think it's a highway and they're just going for it. And it's very unsafe. There's no curb. You might as well be walking on the shoulder of the interstate when you're on Falls Road. So I'm not saying anything that you're doing, I disagree with it, but I'm offering an option. Let some people get together and give you some suggestions, and for a few $1,000s, we may turn this life and death situation into at least one where the risk is reduced somewhat. And get it done in the relatively near future. I think there's already money set aside to do a couple of things. Use it
Yes,
wisely.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a 10,000 plus budget for
So that was
for
my
traffic
question.
safety group projects. So I wouldn't want anyone to feel there wasn't anything happening.
Can we get
Yeah.
specific? Thank you, Bruce,
Yeah.
and thank you for pushing us on this because we need to. The 20K you mentioned that we have in the budget, is that
It's-
the in process?
It's in the budget.
No, I know,
Oh.
but on the village safety groups
They have a proposal.
document
for-
here, it says in process, completion during calendar year 2018.
Yeah.
Is all of this within the 20K? Or is this,
No,
we
no,
need to,
about half is
we need to
traffic
pick some of
safety
these and we have 20K to do
and half is bike
a
ped.
few things, right?
I'm sorry.
To
I was-
Bruce's point about what can we do now? What are we doing now?
Yeah.
Right? The way I read this,
Jane's and Eddie's thing.
yes. Right? Because that's what we're,
They have a project budget, the traffic safety group, beginning July 1, and so does the bike ped committee. And they share that 20 plus there's a $2,000 item under Public Works for striping. Now, those projects are in place and going to occur and are in the budget and,
so is it fair to say
Yeah.
that's what we're doing now? Whatever those projects are, I don't know what they are. I get the sense some of them are on this, some
Yeah.
My understanding is there's striping, which to me would seem like.
fog line striping.
Thing that we don't have to get it as a special thing.
yeah.
In addition to that, something pads, whatever that means, for the crosswalk by the cemetery. And then there was something that also Joe agreed to that I'm not sure makes sense. Another point I don't agree with.
Bruce, you have to get to the mic.
Okay. So there was money set aside in some specific projects, one dealing with the cemetery crosswalk, and then the other with the green strip that was painted green, talk of actually making that grass. Actually heard that Lee suggested using some of that sort of fake brick raised material in there instead of the grass. I actually think that makes a lot more sense. It's going to, the grass isn't going to survive, and especially if it's raised, it's a bit of something, maybe it'll have this effect of sound if a car is drifting towards the sidewalk. So it all sounds like relatively low budget. I don't know what this costs and how much we really have, but there was some money set aside, and this is generally what my understanding is of how it was going to be used.
I think the question might be to you, Bruce, that when you say, what are we doing? We are doing some things. I think the question, the larger question is, what else should we be doing? I don't know that we frankly would ever be doing enough that everybody would be satisfied. But without the partisan and passion that you, for instance, bring to it, we may not even have been doing what we are doing, that Jane and Chris and Jim and Sarah and Susan and Janet have all brought to the table. So I think it's important to note that we do have a series of projects that will occur that this coming summer and fall that are budgeted, but we're discussing a future budget which likely will be based on the demonstration of the demonstrable success of those or failure, and further ideas. Whereas my sense is what comes out of the synthesis are ideas that are far larger in capital consequence of closing off streets. Please don't print that. I'm not suggesting we close down a street, but projects of a scale that to this point have not been imagined by the traffic safety group, which has begun with the early steps of demonstrations meant to inspire further capital investment. And that's my sense of what comes out of the synthesis and the follow-ons, and that's why I've got in mind objectives of actionable results. And it's timely because of budget. So does that help?
Well, my response to this question, because I thought it would come up, is we are doing something. And my answer to that is And what can we do? My answer is when there's traffic no longer going 50 miles an hour through residential neighborhoods, then you're done with what you need to do. A stripe isn't going to do it. I really, this is going on for years and years, over 3 years for me. Some of these people in this group are talking about 10 or 20 years. To me, that's an issue you deal with some urgency. I know money can be produced for things. If somebody dies on that road, believe me, you'll be doing something.
Bruce? As a calming measure, would you put speed bump? What would you do?
There's a couple of things I mentioned to Mary today that I actually got from Jason, the most knowledgeable from Local Motion, most knowledgeable person I've ever been on that road with.
We know Dacian, and we're sorry he's not,
Yeah.
he's no
He
longer there.
suggested
We're very sorry.
two things off the top of his head. One was where the cemetery crosswalk is,
Right.
to have that come out and have sort of a narrowing
Right.
effect, which you do on Harbor Road. Similar things have already been done.
Yeah.
But then you look ahead, and as you're going towards the village, it's wide open again, and they just accelerate again. You do it again. Down by the pump station, he suggested some other sort of a bump out thing. I mean, there's a lot of
At
names.
one point, even talk berms.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Planted
different
berms, yeah.
terminology for these things.
Yeah.
They're relatively inexpensive. It slows people down. Nobody wants to hit a curb at 50 miles an hour, so they're going to slow down.
Yeah.
So it's not a big expense. You got people that will put these options, alternatives on the table for you to look at and just sign it and.
Would it be,
Have you priced that? Has anybody, I mean,
the committee has
When he's
considered
talking,
it.
you've probably driven down Main Street off South
Yeah.
Champlain. Like, that's
Yeah,
a
they just
perfect
did that, yeah.
example of how you bring
That's exactly
you
what he's
narrow the
talking
street
about,
and
yeah.
everybody's driving more slowly.
Yeah.
Would
I
it be
mean-
fair to look to the committee for that decision versus
Which committee are you talking about? Jim?
the traffic safety group?
This is getting really confusing.
No,
No,
well,
that,
Well, we're
you're
just trying
okay,
to
you're gonna be
identify-
fine, don't worry.
We're trying to
sort it
identify
out.
what are some
Yeah.
easy wins, right? And this
Yeah.
committee's done a ton.
Yeah,
and
I
if
mean, it's
we're going
tremendous
to get into
bang for the
budget-
buck going towards life-saving, potentially public safety. What more is a higher priority than that?
would you take that to the traffic safety group and without affecting?
They're represented, right?
Without affecting budget already planned, projects already planned, you in effect are asking for an additional amount of money in the next budget year to be spent on these measures.
If that's what it takes,
And
certainly.
we're as good as what you think they should be spent on, which measures, how much, with what arrangements, and so on and so forth. And maybe the best thing at this point is independent of a synthesis, which we don't have to wait on to know that. No one's beginning to doubt you there. Maybe it would be important for the traffic safety group to come back to us with such ideas. We're as good as what those are.
And could I suggest something else? Also, I'm looking at the in-process for that the Traffic Safety Committee came up with. Instead of repainting that 10-foot, the green strip, instead of installing that, that seems to me to be expensive, the grass that Joe had suggested. Maybe if you can figure out what the breakdown in cost is and compare some of these items with what you suggested, Bruce, and just by way of background, we all know that we had a discussion last meeting and there was follow-up on Front Porch Forum, and then I saw what was happening in Burlington on Main and Champlain, and Bruce sent me a similar picture, so I went out there tonight with Bruce and Janet to look at it, and it seems to me that that kind of traffic calming mechanism has two significant advantages. One, I think it's very inexpensive compared to doing some other things like the curbing and all that. So what we're talking about for folks is a measure where you actually go into the street and put these pylons or cylinder rods, plastic, to squeeze the road a little bit. And then behind that, the city of Burlington has put these gray plastic large planters, and they filled them with dirt, so theoretically nobody would really be hurt if they hit them. The other advantage is I think you can easily remove these items for winter plowing. So that's very cost effective, and there are fewer people on the road in the winter. So I think concerns about safety wane a little bit. I can tell you, I was out there, I walked it with Janet and Bruce tonight. Cars do go very fast. I'm telling everybody what they already know. But I can bring a little of what I learned at the DRB to this, which is it's a residential area, but on the left, or depending on which direction you're going, there's on one side there's a cemetery, on the other side there's a large park. There are no driveways, there's no cuts. And when you have a situation like that, people tend to drive fast. Dave Marshall always used to tell us if there's more driveways on a road, that actually naturally slows people down. So because there isn't that feature, there's this chronic problem. And I think this might be a very inexpensive, separate from what you're doing, Josh, solution. If I could finish. If the allocated money can be redistributed to the Transportation Safety Committee to accomplish that, I think that would be more important than the grass or some of the other things that are listed here.
First of all, my whole intent early was to hive off this from the synthesis. Because in time, they can't relate. And yet each is important in its own way. And Josh has been very insightful about his sense of the synthesis, which began with a comment from Jamie about maybe we should pause, look at what we already have in the file, and think about what we need. But this is a matter of operations, daily, monthly operations and concerns that both can't wait on it and really are not going to be dependent on it. So I'm trying to reassure you that the months-long nothing getting done is not, this doesn't have to be. Because the study has its own time frame and its own objective in the end, which may also give rise to similar ideas that you're proposing. So my sense of it is that we separate the two and that we ask the traffic safety group to convene, and I hope Jane unfortunately is absent and can't be here tonight, and consider some of these ideas, and if it wishes, reorganize its project, the activities to which it was going to spend, on which it was going to spend the money. And if there's in all of that a request for additional monies, that's something we can deal with independently of synthesis. And that seems to me to give us some clarity about, in the 5th or 6th and 7th meeting, about what we're trying to do here. All of us with very good intentions, but sometimes some confusion about what we're really talking about and where we're heading.
Right, and I have no objection to a grant or a study, you know. It's just that despite what we say, it's not one or the other.
Yeah.
Nothing, in my opinion, has happened because cars are still going 50 miles an hour. As long as that thing is showing me 52 showing up, we're not doing anything. A stripe isn't going to fix it. This little discussion we're having and possibly putting enough money together, you know, to bump out in a couple of ways may very well do it. Yeah. And beyond that, you know, a grand study for the town or whatever.
The traffic safety group spent a considerable amount of time on this. They have a lot of expertise. They've looked at other systems elsewhere. Chris looked at, I think when you were in Richmond, you looked at some replication. So there's a lot of experience and knowledge that we would like to tap.
We have a meeting set up with local motion to do some work on July 13th.
Even if we could get maybe Jason to come from where he now is.
Well, we have a new person.
The confidence in the person.
Yeah.
And in ourselves.
Yeah.
And
so
we've seen the Main Street North Champlain. It's very impressive.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Well, I feel better if this effort went on its time, had its own clock, with its own objectives and its own outcomes, and if the effort of synthesis itself, meanwhile, went on as a feed to some very important future actions in terms of town plan and budget. I mean, I think we're going to do better with two two slightly separate paths. you
Yeah,
know.
I mean, I think long-term, there's things that I also think to need to be looked at, and Jason pointed them out to us, like getting into the entrance of the Shelburne Shopping Center where
Yeah.
the Shelburne Supermarket is.
Reducing the width he's talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah, you gotta be quick to get across that
Yeah,
street
yeah,
safely. There's like, there's no mercy, and it's a very wide, crosswalk.
And we want to think about other situations in town
Sure.
that.
But I mean, in
yeah.
a triage way, I mean, I want somebody to come here and argue the case that there's something in this town more dangerous than Falls Road, and, I don't think it could be done. I just haven't seen it. So I think it's the most urgent. But there's other dangerous places all over the place, I'm sure, that
Well,
deserve
any
attention.
of us backing out on Marset will argue with you.
Yeah,
'cause-
yeah.
Could I recommend that at your next meeting, you ask Paul Goodrich to be there so that you could at least get his opinion?
Yeah, that's important.
Are
And
you
I'll
having
certainly
the
be,
village safety group?
Yeah, if you're going to start talking about crosswalks and putting things in the road, wouldn't you want to have,
Not necessarily, I don't know.
I think
if that's
maybe
the
we leave that
appropriate
decision to
time.
Lee,
Yes.
who would be,
We've done that.
okay.
We've included him in some discussions, but I don't know if at the next meeting is necessarily the appropriate time. We'll figure it out.
Okay, good.
One more thing on that note. To me, if Paul Goodrich doesn't like it, it's probably a good thing for traffic calming. He does a
Bruce,
great job
Bruce,
for what he does.
We're not gonna make a
Okay.
comment
But
like
he's-
that
well, I just
about
made it.
anybody in
He-
this
he's-
town,
he's-
much less an employee that's really over the line, and I'll ask you to please sit.
Okay.
Thanks. Any other comments? Susan?
Hi, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm going to beat a dead horse again over the head. Police. The police need to be patrolling these areas between 6 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., not at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. And also, it is, there's a lot of driveways on Falls Road, on our end of Falls Road and Marset, and it doesn't seem to slow anyone down.
No.
I don't know what the answers are, but we need to do something. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Mac, you anything to say, to add?
Yeah. Susan's my wife, and I'm also on the fire department. We go to craziness all the time. Thank you. And it's just frustrating, like what Bruce was saying, 52 miles an hour on. If it says 30, I go 25 just to irritate the people behind me to slow them down. It's like, come on, guys. You're not going to get to the supermarket any faster doing 50 than you are, because you got to put the brake on sometime. It's just, have more presence of the police. They've got a couple of unmarked cars. They can get them out there. There's another thing called mutual aid. You can have a guy from South Burlington or Burlington, or even, I saw state troopers slow right down because some person was going a little bit fast, but they put the brakes on. Just ask these other people in the area just drive through. Just drive through 25 instead of 30.
yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? That'll slow people down. And put it on Front Porch Forum. We are watching you. Okay?
I find when I try to do that, I'm so fearful of what's behind me that I sit on my brake, and the next thing you know, I'm going 10, and everybody's confused. So, Sarah?
Sarah Tompkins. I live over on Falls Road, and I drive back and forth on Dorset Street to go to work every day. And I'm not going to tell you how many times that cars have gone by me so fast they've almost pushed me off the road. In fact, I had one vehicle that did it 2 days in a row, and Tom said I should call the police. But I think that the police presence needs to be there. And I had one day I went to work and there was an empty cruiser sitting on the old dump road, and boy, you should have seen the cars slow down. I mean, there was nobody in it, but I'm sure he was around there somewhere, but there was an empty cruiser sitting there, and you should have seen the brakes come on. So, I think that all of this stuff is wonderful ideas, but what it's going to come down to is having adequate police And Shelburne keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, and I know it's hard for what we have for current police officers to do their jobs, and they do a wonderful job, I'm not saying they don't. But I think when you're talking about spending money, maybe you better look at getting more officers.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, would you accept the idea, sorry,
Okay.
a
go ahead.
notion that this, what we're discussing, is a matter of project level activity, whereas what you're articulating is a matter of policy and priority.
Yeah, but I think a lot of this is getting muddled, and what I said originally may not necessarily hold at this point, and I really do need more guidance, because it seems that justifiably the Falls Road Marset issue is driving the whole concern about transportation issues in general. Okay, so it's unclear to me, as Dean said, a lot of these studies have dealt with this area, even though there's larger. And the question is, all right, if that's really the major the major urgency in here, I'm trying to understand, or trying to get some guidance as to what actually needs to be done if without incorporating a lot of those things, because I think those things need to be done. But it's hard for me to sort of grasp the bigger picture and trying to figure out how to sort of do two different things separately. So, I mean, do we want to step back and say, okay, is this synthesis even necessary at this point? Or should we address this issue first and then see what else needs to be done?
See, that's unfair, because that's what I started earlier tonight.
Right.
I mean, we're trying to decouple this.
Right.
So
And
we
we're going-
achieve on both lines, and that's exactly what I think we're on the verge of understanding, that there's a project level interest on the part of the group, which we encourage, invite, hopefully they'll meet on and prioritize and so on, every other word. Whereas on the other hand, there is an overarching town problem of how much of a priority is traffic safety, how much of a policy should it be,
Okay.
how does it feed to the town plan efforts,
I can see
and
that
and
makes
eventually
sense.
budget town-wide, not
Okay.
just Falls Road, Marston.
Right, that's helpful.
Yeah. Have we gotten there somewhat? Okay. Okay. Are
You
we,
and I can get together
Yeah.
soon and just bring me up to speed from your perspective.
you got enough out of this so
I
that
do.
we can move on?
Yes. I
Okay.
think,
Everything
Yeah.
right here.
I'm sure that you do. And
We certainly thank everybody. We promise you even better and more on July 10th, and meanwhile, a great holiday. So, now, Josh raised the question as well, Lee, about the list of items the items that you listed. And he has a decent question about what are our intentions in terms of timing. And I think it would be, do you want to talk about specific items or just the idea of should we not develop a calendar here?
Yes,
With
that's
some
what
specifics, now that
that's-
we're kind of routinized on the many issues that have come with what was not a very
Right.
lengthy transition.
Right, and that's essentially what I was brought up, is once I saw Lee's list, I'm going, okay, yeah, we've seen that list. How do we tackle that list?
Yeah.
That was my only intent of saying, okay, it's a good list.
Yeah.
How do we schedule dealing with these things?
What would be a good step to ask you, Lee, to just draft up in the next week some preliminary ideas as to which have their own life. Some of these have their own lives, and which are we specifically are waiting on our treatment, service contracts, the town attorney, the information, those are as well, and maybe isolate those so that we could, we as a board, we could share ideas about taking those up. And that would eliminate the ones that have, that are requisite, as well as those like the search that are just continuing.
Right, I was going to offer to take that next step and
Great.
categorize
That would be
those
helpful.
Super.
in
Yeah.
time and space, and we can bring that
That's
up
super.
next meeting.
Thank you. Any further discussion of item, whichever it was? Yeah,
Nine.
whichever it was. None? The next item is a letter to the E911 Board. Some of you may recall that at 2 meetings ago, we indicated that we would prepare a response to the executive director, who was through Lee's arrangement, was very generous with her time and effort to come and speak to us. And he's drafted such a letter that I believe we have in front of us. Is there discussion?
So this hasn't been sent out yet?
It has
No.
not.
Okay. Have you gotten any additional feedback or contact with her since that time?
Just that I know she will do what we're asking her to do anyway, but I think it's really important and helpful that we just put it out there, that thanks for your time. We'd really like to remain informed on this. We value the working relationship, and
Sounds good.
please keep us informed. So
Send it.
if you're okay with that, I'll
Look good?
just
Send it out.
get
For
that.
everybody? Need a vote, or we're,
I think
No.
go
consensus
for
is
it.
fine.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
Any discussion, any comment from the public? Hearing none. The next is the CBC application process, which Mary has been spending much time and effort on, and which she has provided us in draft.
Yes, I don't think we need to talk too long about this. I've received a couple of comments on this. One from the chair, Jerry, and then also today I received a comment, oh no, it was yesterday, a comment from Josh. Josh's comment was, well, let me scroll back. I received a lot of comments from Jerry, which I incorporated in the draft you have before you. I received a comment from Josh about allowing the chairs of CBCs to be made aware when someone applies for a position, so that they could have some input if they felt it was appropriate, and then also know ahead of time who's applied, and give some feedback. So I'm happy to incorporate that into a draft, and I also want to leave a placeholder for any person who applies for and receives an appointment to take whatever oath we come up with. But if people have, if you've had a chance to read it and you have specific comments, can I ask that you email them to me in view of the hour, rather than start editing a document in public?
Yes.
Yes, sounds good.
Happy to do that. Thanks for the effort, Mary. Looks good.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, it looks really good.
Appreciate all the feedback
Yeah.
from everybody.
Can I just ask you one quick question?
Yeah.
Number 4, number 4, member conduct and removal expectations for CBC appointee service. Did I suggest we remove this? I just want to know how bad it's going to be when I say that I should not have.
I can't remember if you, I know that I incorporated all your comments.
Uh-oh.
But
Okay.
I think, so I was purloining from the Heinsberg procedures, which Joe Colangelo provided to me, and their procedures are more involved than this. Theirs included policies for participation and how to participate and expectations. And so I think that Roman numeral 4 was in my original draft that you reviewed.
Yeah,
And what
I was
exists
afraid of that.
now is slightly cut back from what was originally there.
I've had an epiphany, and I will email you
Okay,
a request to restore.
okay.
Okay. And we've shared a thought, maybe now just for a few minutes altogether, that it would be, this may be the most appropriate place to have a oath, pledge, promise, whatever, that was discussed earlier, certainly rather than the ethics ordinance, and in connection with the fact that there's an obligation here to conduct oneself in terms of the ethics ordinance.
As part of the
Yeah.
application process?
As part of the appointment process, I think was the, you know.
Once you're appointed, just like when came onto the select board, we signed a little oath that would be, I think, appropriate to ask
Yeah.
members of CBCs to do the same thing.
Okay.
We
Right.
just have to come up with the content of what that oath is. I'm happy to take a stab at it. And
Yeah.
we might, I don't want to bump up against anything that
No, I think
would be
that's very workable.
inappropriate,
and, yeah, I think makes a whole lot of sense.
And what's
Yeah.
is the notion that
In
as part
accepting
of this,
appointment.
in accepting appointment, appointee agrees to comply
I
with the
pledge
ethics
to
ordinance?
carry
Or I
out my
pledge to.
duties
Yeah.
fairly,
accordance with the-
impartially,
As the
in
kind of
accordance
human
with the
being we
rules
all
of
wanna live with.
procedure,
Yeah.
civilly, politely,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. I'll have to come up with language and we'll have to
You're off
vet
to a
it.
good start.
Yep.
Thank you for all the
Yes.
effort. And I'll certainly email mine. Is there any comment in the public? Any further comment, board? Hearing none. The next item is potential allocation of wastewater, a potential wastewater allocation request.
I have
And
nothing on that, so we can pass
We
right
can
by
move
it.
right on to number 13, which is to set the interest rate charge for late property tax payments per section 9.2 of the town charter.
Section 9.2 of the charter sets what the penalty is for late property tax payments. That's 5%. That's hardwired into the charter. But it also calls for the select board to set the interest rate for late payments on an annual basis prior to each fiscal year. So that's why it's on the agenda to set the interest rate for late payments starting for the new fiscal year that begins in July. Our past practice has been to charge the penalty for the first month of delinquency as the charter provides, but not to charge interest during that first month, and to charge the 1.5% interest for late months, for late payments thereafter. The charter says the interest rate cannot exceed 1.5%. It could be less than 1.5%. It's the board's choice as to what that percentage is. Past practice has been 1.5%. So that's what we're needing to reconfirm.
And that's your recommendation?
Yes.
Discussion?
And this is for the, what fiscal year?
Fiscal year starting July 1st,
FY
2018, so the
19.
18-19 fiscal
18-19.
year.
Yeah.
So we need a motion?
Yes, is there a motion? If we're, any discussion?
Sure.
All set?
Want to take
Is
it?
there a motion?
I motion to set the interest rate for late property tax payments at 1.5% after the initial first month of lateness
For the
for
2008.
the 2018-19 fiscal year.
Josh moves.
Second.
Mary seconds. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Those approving signify by saying aye, please. Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. The next item is the executive session itself.
Nope.
B.
Oh, D.
Post 13B.
Payment, waiving
Waive
payment
fee
for
waiver.
the zoning fee.
Of course.
Thank you.
I
And
just
Lee
knew
will-
there was a big B, but I
Thank
didn't
you.
remember what it was.
I don't know what I'd do without you, Sarah.
So this is at
It's
my,
always 13 and 14B too, isn't it, Sarah? Somehow 17B, it was 17B the last time.
It was.
Yeah.
I like those Bs.
So this is a question I'm bringing to you. As you know, the Development Review Board has approved the Library Town Center project through its hearing process. In the town of Shelburne, one must then also apply for a zoning permit, if you will, a quasi-construction permit. And that fee for that project is close to $6,500. And my suggestion to you is that the Select Board waive that fee, because it doesn't seem to make any sense to me that we take money that we had to borrow and pay interest on out of one municipal pocket only to give it to another pocket of the same municipality. There are other towns in Vermont that routinely do this for their own projects because it just makes sense. Otherwise, we're just moving money around, but we're not actually making any money. And in this case, potentially losing money because we took out a bond to raise the money to do it. So that's the request that I thought would be appropriate to bring to you. The reason I'm bringing it to you in the short run is that until this question is settled, the Planning and Zoning Office may not be able to issue the zoning permit, which then continues to push back potential appeal periods and timeliness issues of construction.
Do you need a motion?
Yeah,
Is this the
there's a time element here.
Is this, when would the fee be payable?
It would be payable as soon as the
the
zoning
next
permit
20
is
days.
desired, which is immediately.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or not. Just by way of example of other fees that have been paid, we asked for a check today for $250 from VTrans to realign the access drive. We had to pay over $43,000 to the state of Vermont, to the Division of Fire Safety, for plan review and inspections. $43,000.
As part of the DRB review?
It's outrageous.
No, that's a state permit.
Oh, that's a state
So there
review.
are other
To
fees
move the
over which we
driveway.
have no control and that are significant in the overall budget.
Yeah,
This is
wouldn't
one we can control because we're just moving money around, but not actually, I just don't
Is
see
that
any
because
value.
it's a
State
state road?
highway.
Well, the driveway permit's because it's a state road. The construction permit is a standard fee any construction project has to pay for review of sprinkler plans and fire safety code issues and several inspections during the construction process. It's a lot of money, though. We're not paying somebody to sit here and watch the construction. Anyway, not trying to throw the state under the bus, just
Right.
illustrating there are significant fees out there. This is one that we can control because it's just moving money around in between departments.
And the consideration along the lines of just internal, whether it's targets for fee allocation for permit fees and within the planning and zoning office, right?
I
Would there,
know
would
that-
there be a way to sort of footnote this and say, hey, you can apply $6,500 in credit
Yeah,
for purposes
absolutely.
of your,
I think at the end of the
Annual
year budget report,
check,
that
right?
could be possible. I know the Planning and Zoning
To me,
Department
that
is
makes
not
sense, right?
enthusiastic
I mean,
about
it's-
this.
There's got to be some equivalence in language.
right?
Sure.
Doesn't it
Oh,
make sense to
absolutely.
give credit where maybe
Absolutely.
the dollars aren't flowing through, but?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, an end-of-year budget report could have a footnote to
Yeah.
that effect.
Because the work's still to be done.
If you were to
Yeah.
approve this.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Do you need a,
If
Any
you're
discussion?
inclined, a motion would be appropriate.
Were any other concerns raised? Or was it more,
In conversation with staff, they were concerned about whether this was setting an adverse precedent, whether they would then not be credited for the work that was done because the revenue line didn't reflect that.
but that's what I just mentioned, right? Isn't
Right.
that the?
Yeah, that should be noted.
I'm going to take comfort from the fact that likely will not be anytime soon another $6 million project.
I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense to charge ourselves,
$18 million project.
whether it's,
That's not soon.
Yeah, until we get to this one, and then,
22, right?
yeah.
I mean, whether it's-
I think a genuine effort on their part should be recognized in every way we can, and you'd have to be confident that you'll find a way to
Yep.
at recognition that doesn't
Yeah, I think-
involve,
So I'm happy to make
yeah.
a motion then in that regard, and I would move to waive the zoning permit fee for the town center application process so long as the
appropriate recognition.
there is appropriate recognition for the zoning office for the work done associated with the waived fee.
Sehr gut.
Second.
A second. Seconded by Jamie. Any further discussion? Any public comment? Those approving signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed, nay. It's a unanimous vote.
Thank you.
And now we arrive at 14. We have two sessions. As far as I recall, we repeat the two motions. We have motions for each portion, don't we? It's not one
Yes.
motion that governs the whole.
Yeah.
In which case, would someone make a motion to?
Are we doing two separate executive sessions?
No.
Okay.
That was my question. If we have executive
We need
sessions,
two
Roman numeral
motions.
1 and Roman numeral 2,
Yeah.
do we need two sets of two, or
I think
does
we
one?
need two motions, but we can go into one executive session.
Well, Josh
Right.
has to recuse.
Josh will
from each.
recuse on
Oh,
the
right,
second,
right,
so,
So, in a sense, you could have the motion to go into the first one, host it, we do what we need to do, come out of it, and then
And then-
immediately
We go in. Okay.
vote to go into the
was
second
my-
one, and if there are different persons
that was what I was
involved.
trying to,
Right.
It
trying to
might keep
understand.
it, the
I thought you were
record
trying to say the
cleaner in
opposite.
case of.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to understand. In which case, is there a motion to hold?
Yeah, I'll move to find that premature public knowledge of labor contract negotiations with members of AFS-CME would clearly place the town at a substantial disadvantage.
Second?
Second.
Seconded by Mary. Any discussion? Hearing none. Those approving signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it.
Move to enter executive session pursuant to the provisions of 1 VSA 313-1B to discuss labor agreements with employees represented by AFS-CME and invite the interim town manager to attend.
Second.
Seconded by Mary. Any discussion? Hearing none. Those approving signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it.
Okay.
And we then need, are we going to return? And
I think that
I
would
think
be the
that's the only way to do
cleanest
it. Yeah,
thing,
okay.
given the
Since we're
different
in-
circumstances
Yeah.
Okay,
between the
gotcha.
sessions.
Yeah.
we'll be back.
You were just saying what?
That we were missing you and you. We said we can't start up because we're missing you.
Thank you.
We're going to have trouble starting our next meeting without you organizing.
I love sitting here.
gotta keep us on track.
Would you like to suggest language of, we have at first, is there a motion to exit
Motion to exit executive session.
executive session? Motion by Josh, seconded by
I'll second it.
Mary. Any discussion? Hearing none. Those approving signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it.
So there's no decision that's been made. We're working on some final clarifying details with the union contract, and we're hopeful and confident that everything will be in order and we'll get to agreement shortly.
I think people were wondering, is it the same contract you were working on the last time?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, just some last minute details.
Okay, is there a motion to enter the next executive session?
Move to find that premature public knowledge of matters relating to the Vermont Railway litigation would clearly place the town at a substantial disadvantage.
Second.
Seconded by Mary. Is there discussion?
It's Linda.
Uh-huh.
Can we ask what this pertains to?
Pertains to VTRR litigation.
Yeah, but in the open meetings law, you have to specify what aspect of that. And this was discussed, I had this discussion with the Secretary of State. It says it has to be more specific than that.
Well, I would call it a status, just a status report of litigation. There's been some time since we've discussed,
And that's-
months, actually, so if that's,
That would be acceptable.
is that helpful?
Yes.
Thank you, Linda. Any further,
Do you
Maddie?
expect any decision to come out of this executive session? Are you guys going to have to make any motions about anything? Do you expect?
I think that might prejudge the discussion a little bit,
Okay.
which is to say, I don't know.
Okay.
No,
Sorry, we can't.
I'd
offer more
hesitate
guidance to let
to
you
say
know.
no and then find nobody here when we got back, yeah. Thanks, Matty. Any further discussion? This would be to invite the town manager, and with the understanding that Josh recuses. Is there
So we
any
didn't
discussion?
vote yet
Yeah, we
about
have to
whether
vote on that.
premature disclosure
Oh,
would.
sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
Will all those who approve signify by saying aye?
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed, nay? Nay. Now the operative motion?
Move to enter into executive session pursuant to the provisions of 1 VSA 313-1B to discuss Vermont Railway litigation status and invite the interim town manager to attend.
Second.
Seconded by Mary. Any discussion? Any public comment? Hearing none. Those approving signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Thank you.